Age ain't nothing but a number, and that number is Mario 64. I don't know what that means, but I thought it would be a catchy sentence to start off this final segment. For many reasons, most of which have already come up during this retrospective, there is a common belief that Mario 64 has not exactly aged well. As a final homage to this game, basically my favorite game of all time, I want to address that claim and try and hopefully make it clear why I don't agree with that sentiment. I do want to make it clear though, I do believe this game has aged, and I'm not even remotely trying to pretend it hasn't. I mean, look at it. Truly a product of its time. But I don't think the game is so outdated that it can be enjoyed through the lens of a modern gamer. First, I'll immediately address the controls, and by that I mean both Mario and the camera. The controls in this game are obviously not perfect. I'd even go as far as to say they weren't perfect for the time either. They obviously get a pass since this game was basically the first of its kind, but that's not relevant to my discussion. The ultimate proof for me that the controls for this game are not perfect is the decades of complaints people have made towards the endgame. And I'm not strictly talking about Rainbow Ride and Tick-Tock Clock either. Many earlier stars get left for the endgame too because of controls like the Red Coin Collection and Hazy Maze Cave, for example. In my opinion, if Mario 64's controls were actually perfect, then the fandom wouldn't have hated those stages nearly as much as they did, because I think it's the controls that makes them hate those stages. I don't think Tick-Tock Clock and Tall Tall Mountain and the like are hated strictly because they're linear. It's because of all those easy ways you fell to your death because Mario didn't quite do what you wanted him to do in those moments with death looming. As I've alluded to through this whole retrospective, the game spends so much time teaching you how to control Mario because they know there's a learning curve. But the reality is there is just so much of the game that can be accomplished without going through the learning curve that players might not even have to figure out how to do anything more than the long jumps and backflips. Stars can be skipped, warps can be used, shortcuts can be taken, etc. A player could basically make their way with only doing a handful of truly difficult stars that require perfect control of Mario, and then if, and only if, they decided to go for 120, that's when they'll have to actually undergo many of the challenges they skipped. But again, revisiting those star objectives will only teach them to control Mario if they still haven't figured out how to cheese the objectives while exploring the stage for easier stars. So even a player that gets to 120 might end up fumbling their way through it without gaining mastery of Mario's controls. The reason I'm getting as deep into this as I can is because a general pattern I've learned is that people that figured out how to control Mario often find these endgame stages to be a lot more enjoyable, and sometimes they're even a favorite. At least, that's the observation I've made with my own experience, the experiences of my friends and family, and hundreds of different Mario 64 videos that I've watched over the past decade or two. I think the enjoyment of Mario 64's linear, tight-spaced challenges is explicitly tied to whether or not a player is willing to take the time to learn how to control Mario in those environments. And really, I think that's as simple as getting used to stopping Mario in place prior to turning, as well as learning to master the trajectory of the cartwheel and relying more on that. I think most players that actually run through the game and enjoy the exploration and the safer, risk-free platforming segments are like 90% of the way there too, because they learn how to do everything else except control Mario in those riskier situations. And going that extra 10% would probably make them enjoy a lot more challenges in this game that they initially deemed impossible. But I'm just theorizing at this point. Basically, I'm saying all of this to highlight that I, someone who always thought that Mario 64 was basically the perfect implementation of Mario's controls and could never imagine people criticizing how flawless that control is, accept that the controls are not perfect. Because if they were, they wouldn't need the adjustments that I just went through. Also, now that we have more 3D Mario games, it's pretty clear what a perfect Mario control should feel like. Despite that, while I don't think Mario's control, or especially the camera control, are perfect, I also don't think it's so terrible that it can't be something a player gets used to. I'd say if you're just someone looking to beat the game through the third Bowser, there's almost no adjustment necessary. You can pick up the controller, and as long as you've played a Mario game or any 3D platformer before, you're basically going to need like 10 minutes to get used to the mechanics and physics, and that's it. You'll improve over time, but even the starting point is more viable for modern gamers. If you're someone looking for full completion, however, that's when I could yield that the controls kinda stink. Again, this is in regards to both the abhorrent camera moments as well as the actual control of Mario. But I don't think the controls aged bad. They were technically already this bad based off my observation of how people feel about linear stages that I just went through. All of this is to say that when it comes to the controls of this game, I think you could find a gargantuan amount of games that didn't age well from that era that would be much better examples. Mario 64's controls and cameras aren't an age issue, they're an adjustment issue. And I know that sounds like semantics, but there are millions of people over the past almost 3 decades that thought and might still think that the game controlled flawlessly. And I have a hard time believing they're all blinded by nostalgia. Heck, there are even people that played Mario 64 for the first time with a Wii U Pro controller as kids that don't criticize the controls. And Mario 64 objectively felt better with a Nintendo 64 analog stick, so that means something. In any case, while yes, the controls aren't what many would consider to be modern, I'm a firm believer that they're hardly so archaic that they can be easily to semi-easily adapted to for modern gamers. Next one is obviously the visuals. Okay, they're ugly, low-poly visuals that have the N64 charm that I personally love but many will scoff at. Most people sort of agree that 3D games didn't start to look good until we hit the GameCube era, and I can completely understand that sentiment. The Nintendo 64 is to 3D visuals what the NES was to 2D visuals. It's got a charm to it, but that's about it. This segment is obviously not one that I can claim with a straight face hasn't aged, but there are plenty of Nintendo 64 games that I can go back to, even on a CRT, and wonder how on earth I was even able to tell the difference between various models on screen. So while the visuals have obviously aged, I think they've aged a lot better than many games from that era, which is funny because almost all of them came after Mario 64. And I genuinely wonder if the reason Mario 64 aged better is because they didn't get too detailed with many of the designs and kept it simple, whereas the more ambitious titles from that era overdid it and suffered as a result. I'm not quite sure, but that being said, the visuals and atmosphere and ambiance all did a phenomenal job. Every stage immerses you. There's a certain aura. Okay, let's get this out of the way. Guys, I'm the last person to discuss all the weird visuals, memories, Mandela effects, personalizations, negative auras, and all that other stuff that the fanbase has been going through since the COVID days. I thought it was a meme, but no, there's a whole lot of you that fall in line with it. The game is scary and lifeless and gave you all nightmares, I guess? Every time I mention a good atmosphere, or a sinister environment, or a serious tone, someone pops up and says something that sounds ripped straight out of a 1980s mental thriller flick, and mentions icebergs. I don't know. I guess to each their own. I always just thought the ambiance was good and enjoyed the low-poly charm, and that was enough. If y'all want to take these discussions and run with them, then you do you. I'm only glossing over this stuff because that's all anyone keeps pointing out in the comments. Next up is the music. I love pretty much every tune in this game, and I think they, for the most part, complement the stages they play in. There are obviously not enough tracks though, and considering there are only 15 stages, I feel like they could have figured that out. But I'm not a game developer or a composer. Either way, the music is all iconic and I can listen to it for hours, but I also kind of want to address a bit of an observation to the music. As I was going through this whole process, I started to make many connections between stages, primarily between stages on the main floor and upstairs like I mentioned in some of my earlier segments. And I actually think I was onto something, or I should say 10-year-old me was onto something, because that's when I first kind of started thinking about this. The stages in this game are for the most part made in pairs, with a single exception. And it's not just about the music, but that is an obvious portion of it. Keep in mind, a lot of this is just a theory and I have no proof to back it, but this is just kind of how I viewed it when I was younger. Many people would assume Bob-omb Battlefield and Whomp's Fortress are a pair because of the music, but that wouldn't be correct in my opinion. The stage design elements differ too much for that to be the case. Bob-omb Battlefield is a giant open area with a single peak, whereas Whomp's Fortress is a vertical stage that has a more linear traversal. The stages upstairs make a much better match. Tiny Huge Island not only shares the music with Bob-omb Battlefield, but also shares the aesthetic and the level type. It's a wide open sandbox with a peak in there that players can climb. In many ways, it's a harder version of the battlefield, including the second race with Koopa the Quick. Likewise, Tall Tall Mountain shares the music and tone of Whomp's Fortress, but also it somewhat mirrors the stage design layout. In my opinion, it does to Whomp's Fortress what Tiny Huge Island did to Bob-omb's Battlefield. These 4 stages all share a tune, and they're the only 4 stages that have this tune. I think the game basically needed one more song, and the duology of these stages would be a lot more clear. Because instead of people seeing it as them reusing the song from Battlefield over and over again, people would have just said every tune gets used twice. There are 2 snow-themed stages, and they share the same tune. There are 3 water stages, and 2 of them share the same tune. At first, I thought Jolly Roger Bay and Wet Dry World were meant to be sister stages, since the other 3 stages on the first floor had sister stages on the third floor. But then I realized not only does Dire Dire Docks have the same music, it actually is more of the same type of water level as Jolly Roger Bay than Wet Dry World. And Wet Dry World clearly has the same vibe as Hazy Maze Cave, and many of the same absurd nightmares people get because of their backgrounds or whatever, as well as the same music, and they're both stages built around maze-like puzzle-solving assets. They're clearly sister stages here. The first 2 truly open square sandbox stages a player will enter are Shifting Sandland and Lethal Lava Land, and go figure, they have the same tunes as well. And also both have a central gimmick involving the entry into the volcano and pyramid. And finally, the 2 remaining courses are both ridiculously linear, require tight space control of Mario, and are the hardest pair of stages in the game, and also share the same music. This game is basically made up of 7 pairs of stages that share tunes with one another, and 2 of the pairs have the same song for some inexplicable reason. While Big Boo's Haunt is the standout here and doesn't get a partner. But to be fair, there are no stages in the game that are even remotely similar to what's going on in Big Boo's Haunt. So it makes sense it doesn't share a song with any other stage. Anyway, yeah, I just thought this was a fun observation. It seems to me like these stages come in pairs, and that's how the music tracks were determined for the stages. And if there was one more track that was used for Whomp's Fortress and Tall Tall Mountain, that would have probably been a lot more clear for everyone. Or this might just be a reach. Either way, the music or lack of additional tracks aren't a massive outdated concept that doesn't occur in modern games. Many modern open world games have the same track play over and over again in the main area that takes up 75% of the game. So at least here it's a bit more distributed. Plus some of the tunes here are still in line with the most iconic in the series. Aside from that, you have the stage design. I already went in depth on all these stages, but basically you have linear stages, puzzle solving stages, and open sandbox stages. Every stage has a little bit of all of these aspects, but usually 1 or 2 of them stick out more than others. Or in the case of Bob-omb Battlefield, they threw all of it in there to really get a player introduced to the game. Seriously, it's a giant open sandbox with a linear path up through the summit with a whole island in the sky puzzle. A really good introduction to all of the different types of stages you'll face later. But anyway, I think the game did a great job with the variety of missions and managed to not make too much of the game feel overly repetitive. Even though every stage had 100 coin collections and red coin challenges, they never felt like the same star because the stages varied enough in aesthetic and placement of the coins, as well as a uniqueness in design and challenges. There are many stars in this game that feel simply like a direct A to B type star. Some of them are in linear stages like Tick-Tock Clock, but some of them are in sandbox stages with no bottomless pits at all like Snowman's Land. These star objectives in these stages are implemented in a manner that will naturally guide a player along a specific path. They're very much stars that I firmly believe would take place in a 64 version of Mario 3D World, and they're well spread out throughout the game. And likewise, you have many stars that will reward curious players for exploring every nook and cranny with nothing but a simple hint. So a player may be tasked with going through linear paths or puzzle solving or exploring stages that are either sandboxes, linearly built, or mazes, all while using their exploration and problem solving skills as if they were strictly open Mario Odyssey style stages. The observation I've made here is that the stage design, as well as the specific star objectives, not only vary quite a bit, but they're mixed and matched throughout the various environments that allow for different types of challenges to make these stages unique. It's something that I don't think this game gets quite enough credit for. People will just shrug off Tick-Tock Clock for its linearity, but there's also a whole puzzle and exploration challenge related to riding the clock hands, or heck, it's a linear stage with one of the most unique puzzles strictly for entering the clock. Or even in an earlier example like the brick wall in Whomp's Fortress. I think the diversity of all these different objectives, as well as my empirical analysis of the stages in the previous segments, is important to note when someone considers the gameplay of Mario 64 outdated. The game is somewhat punishing a player for removing them from the stage for only 24 out of 120 stars. In all other cases, it's the end of the objective, an accomplishment of a task, and a chance to start fresh in the same stage or head on to a new one. I don't think new players even felt frustrated by this design element. It's mostly repeat players that are complaining about it. Because when you're actually running through the game, the exit and entry feels natural since you haven't completely memorized the maps. Now obviously there are a lot of quality of life improvements that are in more recent games like maps and unlimited lives and whatnot, but ultimately I think the stage design and the general flow of the gameplay as you go through this game is not only not outdated, it lives up to some of the best modern day 3D platformers. Basically what I'm trying to say is that I don't think this game hasn't aged well. I think it's aged as much as it's expected to age. And anybody that put in an effort to learn all of the fancy maneuvers in Odyssey could put a fraction of that effort to master Mario moveset in 64. The stages, the music, the aesthetics, the challenges, and just the overall experience of the game from start to end is still very much something that anybody between the ages of 5 and 50 could pick up and fall in love with. And again, I know this because even until now, there are more and more people doing just that. This whole experience has been roughly 65,000 words of scripts. To put things into perspective, my Sonic 06 retrospective was half of that, and that was a 2.5 hour long video. I've enjoyed the heck out of this though, and I've touched up on almost everything that I've wanted to touch up on. After all, this is my favorite game of all time, and I only really get to cover it once. So you can be damn sure I'm going to say everything I want to say. And it's very fitting that this retrospective has gotten more traction than anything else I've ever worked on since starting this channel. I'm really happy I did this. My scripts were written without even playing the game. I have a bunch of stock footage from old playthroughs, and some family members and friends helped out with that too. But I was literally able to get through each stage and write out the script based off memorization. That's how much I love this game. I imagine many of you could do the same thing too, and this is probably one of the few games in the world that so many people would be able to do that for. I didn't discuss all of the mods, the game breaks, the speedrunning and whatnot because I'm not versed enough in those communities. I've always just observed them from afar, but I've always admired the passion those communities have towards the game. Those are people that have way more passion for this game than I do, which is crazy for me to think of because I can't imagine someone having more passion for Mario 64 than I. And finally, before I close off, there are just a couple things I need to get out of the way so I can move on. First, this one's kind of obvious, but when I did my Mario vs. Sonic series back when this channel was at less than 300 subscribers, I told everyone back then that I'd eventually do a Mario 64 vs. Sonic Adventure video. Well, both my Sonic Adventure video and my Mario 64 vids were long as hell, and I didn't really do a head-to-head comparison in the same way that I did the classics. I obviously like Mario 64 more than Adventure, that's probably clear to most of you. 64 is my favorite game of all time after all. But I've always said that I like Sonic Adventure 2 more than Mario Sunshine. I'll see if that holds when I cover Sunshine. So this is kind of my mini announcement that I'm going to cover Sunshine. Either that or 64DS. Well, let me restate that. I'll cover both of them, I just don't know which one I'm doing first, and then I'll do the other one after. These daily videos seem to be working out for me though, so I'm going to try and swing straight into it and keep the momentum going. By the time you're watching this, I might already have made the first video, so just check back here tomorrow, or the day after, or at the very least Saturday at 11 AM Eastern since I always hit that time slot. I want to go through the whole 3D Mario series the same way I did Sonic earlier this year, and I would love for you all to join me on that journey. And finally, the last thing I'd like to do is to rank these stages. I've been thinking about it quite a bit, and I'm not sure which stage is my favorite, so let's try and figure that out together. Let's go in order. Bob-omb Battlefield is below Whomp's Fortress. Jolly Roger Bay is in last. Cool Cool Mountain is above all three of those. Big Boo's Haunt sits just below Cool Cool Mountain. Hazy Maze Cave is probably tied with Bob-omb Battlefield for me. Lethal Lava Land sits with both of those. Shifting Sandland is about tied with Whomp's Fortress. Dire Dire Docks sits below Lethal Lava Land. Snowman's Land is just about the same as Dire Dire Docks. Wet Dry World, I'm gonna throw straight into the top with Tall Tall Mountain. Tiny Huge Island sits with Cool Cool Mountain. Tick-Tock Clock sits right up there with the others in first. And Rainbow Ride sits with Tiny Huge and Cool Cool Mountain. So you have S rank, Tick-Tock Clock, Tall Tall Mountain, Wet Dry World. A rank, Tiny Huge Island, Cool Cool Mountain, and Rainbow Ride. B rank, Whomp's Fortress, Shifting Sandland, and Big Boo's Haunt. C rank, Bob-omb Battlefield, Hazy Maze Cave, Lethal Lava Land. D, Snowman's Land, Dire Dire Docks, and E, Jolly Roger Bay. Funnily enough, I like everything from D tier and upwards, but I think visually laying them out like this in a tier list makes it easier to look at. The only stage I actually don't like is Jolly Roger Bay. Everything else is good, but obviously the higher you go, the more I like it. I'm leaning towards Tick-Tock Clock being my favorite stage for its linearity, Wet Dry World being my favorite stage for its exploration, and Tall Tall Mountain being my favorite stage for its combination of both. I don't know that I can pick a single stage from those three, but this is good enough for me. Anyway, I think I've said enough. Thank you all so much for joining me along this journey. Enjoy your holidays and hopefully your time off. Spend a lot of time with your loved ones or doing what you love. And feel free to go through my Mario Party, Classic Mario vs. Sonic, Donkey Kong Country, 3D Sonic, and Mega Man and Metroid playlists, if you want to see me go way too in-depth about those games. Either way, check back here at 11 AM Eastern Time.